The topic under discussion is a very, very important topic, and it was already introduced while we were having this chatting session. The challenge of proximity, managing India's subcontinental periphery. So India, as we all know, has a hegemonic position in the South Asian region. Its position in the South Asian region is not similar to Germany's within the European region, and that produces challenges for India. So Ambassador Shyam Saran wants to tell us how this predicament can be managed to have a region which is happy both for the largest power as well as for the neighboring powers who must also be able to live with India. The floor is yours, Ambassador Shyam Saran.
Thank you very much, Rahul. Thank you very much for your very generous introduction. Yes, I will be speaking about India's neighborhood. Let me, in the half an hour that I have, just try to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and on this particular topic. As far as my perception about the neighborhood is concerned, what strikes me is that the Indian subcontinent is really a single geopolitical unit. It's also, in a sense, a single geo-economic unit with as well as shared history, very strong cultural affinities, economic linkages across the region, which have again very, very long standing. So in a real sense, this is an identifiably one single unit, in a sense, political unit. But at the same time, you have today several independent and sovereign states which occupy this space. And the challenge is that despite occupying this single space, the countries of the region have very different security perceptions. They do not have a common view of the future of the subcontinent. And the biggest problem is that for many of the countries of the region, far from having a shared security perception, in fact, they perceive India as their security challenge. So despite the fact that this region really through history has been a region which has been, in a sense, very identifiably a recognizable geopolitical unit, today, politically, it is fragmented. So the challenge for India is that despite this fragmentation, the largest country in the region is India. So whether we like it or not, for India, the security challenge does not stop at its borders. It really is the entire subcontinent. We have to look at the entire subcontinent in terms of India's own security challenges. Also, we have to recognize that in more recent times, of course, the most dramatic event was the partition of the subcontinent in 1947, when India also became independent, Pakistan became independent. And what it did was that a lot of the transport arteries which connected north, south, east, west of the subcontinent together, those in fact were interrupted. Those were severed. And also, at the same time, you had growing nationalist sentiments amongst the independent countries of the region. In the process of nation building, they became, in fact, much more mindful of their own national identities, playing down the shared interests, the commonalities which joined them together. So this is the first point I would like to make, that the subcontinent is actually one single geopolitical unit with very strong complementarities, intra-regional economic complementarities, which actually bind them together. There is also, as I said, very strong cultural affinities amongst the peoples of the subcontinent. But there is that fragmentation which we have to take into account. What is the other feature of the subcontinent? The other feature of the subcontinent is, as I mentioned, that India is by far the largest country in the region in terms of area, in terms of population, but much more importantly, in terms of economic as well as military capabilities. India's strengths, India's capabilities are more than all its neighbors put together. So there is this very strong asymmetry power asymmetry that exists within the subcontinent. And this has a plus point and this has a minus point. The plus point, the minus point first. Because of that asymmetry, it should come as no surprise that most of the smaller neighbors, therefore, have considerable apprehension and anxiety about the threat of domination from this very large, neighbor that India is. And this has always driven them to look for balancing factors. How do we try to neutralize to some extent this very, very overwhelming power that India enjoys in the region? And how India responds to those balancing moves on the part of the neighbors. This is something that is also a big challenge as far as neighborhood policy is concerned. Now, don't forget that there has also been an effort on the part of India's neighbors to try and come together themselves, to try and provide a counterbalance to India, and that was the setting up of the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, which is SAARC, as you know. There is no doubt that it was seen by the smaller countries in the region as a mechanism to try and counterbalance some of the very overwhelming domination which India enjoys. And India, that is why India, in a sense, reacted rather negatively to the SAARC in the early stages. It was not very enthusiastic about SAARC to begin with. It did look upon SAARC as a ganging up of its smaller neighbors against India. And to be fair, most of the smaller neighbors also thought about SAARC in the same terms. So that's something that we have to take into account. Now, what I wanted to also convey was that if we look at the trajectory of India's relationship with its neighbors, you see a period where there is both in India as well as amongst its neighbors, almost a kind of a sense of siege. India sort of reacting to its periphery as if this was a hostile periphery. And India had to protect itself in a sense. So you close off, try to put walls around you in order to protect your interests. There was a similar kind of a sentiment amongst the neighbors themselves, that we need to be able to keep India away somehow. Otherwise, it will undermine our interests. So this, what it did was that those interconnections which were there before 1947, whether it was railroads or highways or waterways, particularly important as far as the East is concerned, all these different arteries, the interconnections which bound this subcontinent together, these interconnections were, as I mentioned, severed. Post 47, instead of trying to overcome these interruptions, in fact, there was a reinforcement of those disconnections, in a sense, because of this sentiment that, there is a hostile neighborhood, there is on the side of the neighbors, that there is a dominating, power on our doorstep. So what it did was that it, instead of trying to bring the countries of the region together, in fact, it reinforced the sense of division. So that has to be also taken into account. Now, how has India's attitude towards this neighborhood, how has it changed from that period? So we went through a period, as I said. Yes, you have to manage your neighborhood, but you have to basically make sure that they are not able to adopt hostile policies towards you. And in that respect, Pakistan was a very special case because it was amongst the countries in the neighborhood, was perhaps seen as the major threat to India. But what India tried to do was, as I mentioned, adopt policies in order to try and safeguard India by adopting policies of, in a sense, I wouldn't say isolation, but in a sense of trying to, insulate India from what was seen as hostile, tendencies around in the neighborhood. This began to change from the time that India actually made a major change in its policies through economic reforms and liberalization in the early 1990s. From being a very autarkic kind of an economic system, very much, stressing self-reliance, India made a very dramatic change, as you remember, became a much more outward-looking economy. Began to see its economic interests better served by closer integration with the very dynamic, Southeast Asian, East Asian region, and also globally. Its relationship with, say, Europe or the United States of America in the economic field became that much more, tense than compared to before. Now here, the interesting thing is that initially, if you look at the early 1990 period, I would say from, about 1990 to, the year 2000, that particular decade, there was a debate going on in India with regard to the neighborhood. There were those who felt that, forget about these pesky neighbors that you have around you. You will not really be able to do very much in terms of developing a really positive relationship with them. They are not really so important as far as your own economic interests are concerned. In a sense, leap over them and integrate yourself with this very dynamic, Southeast Asia, East Asia region. So the neighborhood itself was not part and parcel of how India saw its economic integration with the region as well as with the world. This began to change sometime around the turn of the millennium, in a sense, where India began to believe then that even its aim of integrating more closely with the region of Southeast Asia and East Asia and globally, the base for that has to be greater economic integration within its own region, within the subcontinent itself. That efforts to bring about greater integration with Asia and with the world would be suboptimal if you do not do a better job of managing your periphery itself. So began to look at, sort of concentric circles of cooperation and collaboration, where the inner circle was actually the subcontinent. And then radiating from the subcontinent was, the larger Asian economy, and then the larger, global economy. So this was a very important change. So India's view of SAARC also, underwent a very important change. So you have Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the Prime Minister, going to the SAARC summit in Kathmandu, I think it was in 2003, where he made some very, ambitious kind of plans for the for the region, talking about how there should be a customs union for South Asia. There should be a common currency for South Asia. Why not? May even have a South Asia parliament, directly elected parliament. In fact, posing the model of the European Union in a sense for South Asia's future. So this represented a very important change, because then SAARC began to be seen as a possible vehicle for bringing about that regional economic integration, without which it would be difficult for India to really pursue much more successfully integration with the Asian region and the global economy. And it was also then felt that our ability to play a larger regional role with our growing influence, larger global role, you needed to manage again your periphery much better than you had been able to. That is, if there were crises all the time in your own neighborhood, this will always keep pulling you back. So it is in India's interest that you should have a much more stable, even an economically viable and dynamic neighborhood, which would support India's regional role and a global role, rather than become a major constraint on that role. So this was also a mindset change which took place around that time. Of course, that might have been the aim, but things have not quite worked out the way it may have been envisaged at that time. As a result of this change, a new element was a very strong emphasis on connectivity. This became a buzzword, particularly after this change in India's attitude towards SAARC. So, how do we reconnect, the subcontinent? Some of those transport arteries which had been severed, can we reconnect them again? Can we bring about other means of connecting the region much more closely together? This was the period when we were talking about setting up integrated checkposts, for example, on the India-Nepal border, India-Bangladesh border, even on the India-Pakistan border. This was also the time when we were looking at free trade agreements or comprehensive economic cooperation agreements with, say, Sri Lanka. This was also a period where we were talking about SAFTA, the South Asia Free Trade Area, preferential trade area. In terms of, if you see the proliferation of different kind of projects which were conceived during this particular period for bringing about that more dense interconnectivity between amongst the countries of the region, this was a very productive period in that sense. And actually, a lot of projects were undertaken, whether it's railroads or highways. The last successes were, for example, with the motor vehicles agreement, the railway agreement, if not amongst all the South Asian countries, but amongst what is known as the BBIN framework, the sub-regional framework, that is, Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. I mean, Pakistan refused to join this. So connectivity became a very important element in this. But what has happened is that while progress has been made in terms of physical connectivity, some of the mindset that I was telling you about, that you look upon borders as walls behind which you have to hide and protect yourself, that mindset has not really changed very much. And, the security element has always been sort of an overriding concern. So even if you make a glass top highway across the border, say India-Nepal border or India-Bangladesh border, the behind the border, procedures continue to be so, onerous, and the security concerns seem to be so, so prominent, in fact, that, I have to look at each and every, container to see that there is no bomb inside or nothing else is being smuggled. So many of the new technologies in terms of, say, use of holograms, GPS tracking systems. You have software which enables you to have a great deal of, a sort of certainty about the movement of cargo by doing random testing, of cargo which is going across the border. This is now standard procedure across most other regions. But it is fair to say that as far as India's relationship with its neighbors are concerned, this has not really taken off very much. The other problem is that with respect to this connectivity amongst the countries, India, you must have heard a lot of the time we say, India does not have transit through Pakistan. You see the problem with regard to trying to get some wheat across to Afghanistan, because, transit has to be arranged through Pakistan. The creation of Pakistan essentially severed India's links with Central Asia, with the Gulf, the land border. So Bangladesh, for example, until recently, no transit was possible to India's northeast from the rest of India through Bangladesh, which was the most convenient access. Ability to use the river system for transportation in these. All these were in fact very difficult to sort of put in place. But what has happened is that while India complained about transit through its neighbors, India has been most difficult in terms of giving transit to others. Because, if you look at the map, India has borders with other neighbors, but those neighbors don't have borders with each other. So India is actually the transit country. So, a study was done, for example, for the transportation of a 20-foot container, say from Dhaka to Islamabad. And, the current sort of routing is from Dhaka, it goes to Chittagong by road. Then it is transshipped into a ship which goes right around the Indian subcontinent, lands at Karachi. Then it is transshipped onto a truck, which then takes it to Islamabad. Takes almost 3 weeks, and the cost is something like about 7 to 8 times what is paid would be paid if the cargo could move on the existing railway system from Dhaka all the way to Islamabad. 5 days. And the cost would be about 1/5, if not less. So that's the kind of price which you are paying for, even if you are physically connected, you are not really, taking advantage of the proximity. So when I talk about the challenge of proximity, this is really the challenge, that even though you are very close to one another, and that there should actually be a great advantage that you can leverage against others, you are actually not being able to use it. You're not able to leverage it. So this is how do we ensure that we have not only the hardware of connectivity in terms of whether it is roads or railways or optical fiber highways amongst the countries, but also have the right kind of software, right kind of policies that actually allows a very smooth the exchange of goods, of peoples across these borders. That is the big challenge that we face. Now, the other, of course, issue that I would like to end with is really the political side. Earlier, even though those interconnections were not there with all the neighbors, there is no doubt that India was the dominant power in the region. And its influence extended across the region. This was not really challenged very much, neither by the neighbors themselves, nor by outside powers. They recognized that India was overwhelmingly the major power. There was always, of course, an effort by outside powers to try and challenge India's dominant position in the region. This was, for example, in the old days, it was even the United States of America, which was seen by India as a hostile presence. China always has been there, but China's footprint was very, very small in the early days. The one country which very successfully used outside powers to balance India was, of course, Pakistan. Becoming a part of the Western alliance, military alliance system, later on by also allying itself with China. But if you look at the rest of the neighbors, they did not really, in a sense, effectively challenge India's dominant position. And it was understood that, in terms of India's security concerns, you would have to be mindful of those concerns. What has changed over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years is the dramatic increase in the presence of China in our neighborhood. So what was a concern by India that, China was beginning to challenge India's position in these countries. Now that has become a much bigger concern. Now, that is also because China has far more resources than India has to be able to deploy in the region. So it is in terms of the economic objectives of the countries in the region to build up their infrastructure, to build up their economic capabilities, have a more important trading relationship. There is no doubt that China has become now a very, very substantial presence in the subcontinent. So adding to the various challenges that I mentioned, we also have this new factor. A new factor in the sense is the factor that was always there, but which has become far more salient than it was ever before. So you see this, for example, in Nepal. While China was essentially focused over the last several years, even when I was ambassador in Nepal, and I had very close links with the Chinese ambassador there. Their main concern was really with regard to the security of Tibet. They were not really so much concerned about, having expanding their influence in Nepal beyond that point. They just wanted to make sure that Nepal did not become a base for any kind of hostility towards, challenging China in Tibet. In the last 10 years, that has changed. Now, China is looking at its interest in Nepal much more expansively than what was the case before. Tibet, of course, remains a concern. But it is now looking at actually, we are even talking about, some kind of a grouping, trans-Himalayan grouping. They had invited, representatives from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan did not attend, but Bangladesh, to see how there could create a kind of an economic circle, a trans-Himalayan economic circle of cooperation, dominated, of course, by China. And this caused a considerable amount of concern in India. So India is constantly, responding to this playing of the China card by most of our neighbors. And the issue is really, what is the way in which India can meet this, this challenge? Yes, India does deploy a very large amount of resources in the region, but it has not been so effective. Its delivery capability is somewhat limited. China scores on that point, that whatever commitment it takes up, it is able to deliver on it very, very quickly. On the Indian side, there are so many, sort of bureaucratic red tape and delays, which is, by the way, not just for the external, it is also, as you see, a domestic problem in India, the delivery. So this is something which we have not been able to put our act together. And in terms of the proximity that I spoke about, really to look at proximity as an asset, because China may be developing linkages, transport linkages with South Asia. You have the China-Pakistan economic corridor. They are investing in infrastructure in Nepal. Also, at least trying to get Bangladesh also to accept Chinese support through the Belt and Road initiative. And if the relationship with Bhutan improves, there are a lot of Bhutanese who are also very keen to get Chinese support for infrastructure development in Bhutan itself. You see what is happening in Sri Lanka with regard to, say, wood development, very close to India's shores. So how do we respond to that? So one major concern today is really focused on this. What kind of policies does India adopt with regard to the neighborhood, which will enable it to meet this Chinese challenge? What are some of the ways in which we can actually leverage what China is doing in South Asia to advance our own interests? So not look at every project that China does in the region, every sort of involvement in the region as necessarily being directed against India. But is there some way that you can actually leverage that for your own interests? China has also floated the idea of, using, for example, Nepal as a transit country for entry into India, and perhaps it could be, vice versa as well. But what are the other ways in which we can leverage some of the assets and advantages that we have vis-a-vis China? So proximity, I also mentioned as an advantage that you have, geographical advantage which you have, which for China is more difficult because you are next door. So how do you leverage being next door? That is something that you need to think about. How do you lead the regional integration process in the region? If you are the largest country in the region, you are the largest economy in the region, can you think of ways in which you become the engine of growth, engine of development for the entire region? How do you become the source of global public goods for the region, a net security provider for the region? These are some of the things that are being talked about. So with regard to, for example, economic integration, the fact is that if you opened up the Indian market to everything which any of your neighbors are ready to or able to sell to you, it would still be a small fraction of the Indian market. That's something important to know. Secondly, if supposing you said that the entire transportation infrastructure in India, including its ports, our neighbors can use the way they want it. So you don't use transit as a kind of a barrier, but you use transit to become the preferred partner in terms of transit. So even if everything that the neighbors want to transport on your transport infrastructure, still it would be a very small percentage of the total carrying capacity of your transport network. So there are this way of thinking that economic integration, actually you can be the driver in the region if you adopted the right kind of policies without really having to give very much, without having to lose very much, because you are such a large economy. So one of the things that I have also argued is that you should offer actually what I call national treatment to all your neighbors. That is, whatever are the facilities which are available to an Indian entity, let that be available to your neighbors as well. So the bottom line here is you become the preferred partner in terms of the economic objectives of your neighbors. Not exercise, for example, leverage by holding the threat of blocking off. Say, Nepal always has this fear that, it will be, as a landlocked country, it will be blocked by India. So rather than use this access as leverage, you use access as, something that actually gives you greater influence in terms of your relationship with these countries. So not try to follow China, stadium for stadium or factory for factory or road for road, but decide what are your areas of strength and leverage that. And lastly, in this context, I would mention that, the fact that you have the kind of cultural affinities, people to people linkages that you have throughout the region, this China does not have. So the challenge for you is, how do I leverage these very strong affinities amongst our people to really be reflected in the political relationship amongst the countries? That is something which is very important in terms of the neighborhood policy. And to end, whatever we are talking about today, all the different tensions which are there, all the different conflicts which are there, all this pales into insignificance and may become irrelevant given the kind of ecological challenges which we face. So I mentioned that, the South Asia is a single geopolitical unit. But much more important than that is that South Asia or the subcontinent is a single ecological unit. You can't deal with, say, the melting of glaciers in the Himalayas even if you are the largest country in the region. You have to work together with the others. You have to work together with Pakistan. You have to work together with Nepal, with Bhutan. Without that, it is very difficult to. If you're looking at, for example, the challenge of rising sea levels with regard to, say, island countries like the Maldives or Sri Lanka, we also have island territories. We have also low-lying coastal plains. How do you deal with this issue? How do you deal with, all of us are affected by the monsoons. But even the sharing of information on the monsoons does not take place amongst the countries of the region. Now, this is an extraordinary situation. So this is the realization which has to come, that forget about all the different conflicts and challenges which you have. There is just round the corner is waiting a challenge, much, much bigger challenge, which only way that you can deal with it is by actually working together. This was also apparent during this pandemic, that here is a challenge which recognizes no national borders, recognizes no regional borders. And the only way that you can really deal with it is by working together. So some effort was made in that direction, but not seriously enough. Now, which is the country which can take a lead in this respect? Again, as the largest country in the region, as a country which has the most at stake, it is only India. So one of the things that we have been suggesting, in the new sort of paper that we have produced on new strategy for India is, how do we raise this ecological issue onto the agenda of South Asia cooperation with India, really taking the lead. So I will stop here and maybe we can explore some of these issues in the question and answer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shyam Saran. I think what you have just laid out is a very, very significant proposal. It's also an extremely rational proposal. It has a lot of positive, some elements to it, if rationality prevails. So I think I mean, from someone coming from the policy community, I think this is the first time I have heard, maybe I haven't followed this discourse so closely. But the kinds of things you're mentioning are actually very close to my heart, and I have done some research, not at a sort of South Asian level, but at least some country-to-country research that shows that India's being a little more benevolent can certainly not harm either India or its neighbors. Also, the ecological challenge that you mentioned is a very, very important point, and serendipitously enough, my geography the geography chair in our institute, Marcus Nusser, and I are planning to invite scholars from India and Pakistan to look at how the scientific aspects of climate change can be addressed through negotiation. So we have in the Institute some people who know this subject better than others in the world. They also have traveled to India and Pakistan and have seen the glaciers and measured them on both sides. We have certain advantages, and this was actually just being discussed between the two of us, and we wrote a small grant proposal. I don't know whether it will get funded, to invite scholars from India and Pakistan to the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg. And if we can combine politics with the knowledge of science to see, if persuasive arguments can be made. And I'm really delighted that as a practitioner, you sort of made the pitch so strongly. It's really heartening for me to note that. But I don't want to occupy the question and answer session at this point in time. The floor is open. I don't know if Dr. Wagner would like to open up with some questions or some comments.
Yes, Rahul, thank you very much. There have already been one or two questions in the chat box by some of the participants. Maybe we can go.
Yeah, we can go like that. Okay.
We can go like that, but I would also have a question then. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
We do that. So the first question is by one of our students who is from Nepal, who says that, how do you see the future of SAARC? As it has not been able to have a summit since 2016, do you think India's pessimism is ultimately going to kill SAARC? The other question from Simant Bharati is, recently China's South Asia policy targeted need-based requirement for India's neighbor countries. For example, loans, aid for poverty, COVID-19 vaccines, technical and infrastructural support. How does India address these issues with its neighborhood first policy and its efficacy? So maybe we can take these two first, and then would you like to add something, Christian? Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
I go ahead, or
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So as far as SAARC is concerned, it has become a casualty of, like in the past also, India-Pakistan relations, or India-Pakistan non-relations, I should say. And this is unfortunate because, SAARC is the only subcontinental wide forum for collaboration, for cooperation. And if India has any credible, plan for regional economic integration, despite, the issues that we are facing, you cannot do without SAARC. So I would hope that the government of India sees merit in actually allowing SAARC to once again, become the key forum for South Asia, its own South Asia policies. Secondly, we have also argued that, there are some people in India who are talking about BIMSTEC as being a kind of a rival to SAARC. And BIMSTEC, of course, does not have Pakistan, but it has several other neighbors of India represented in it. This is something that we have also commented about, that let the BIMSTEC should be promoted for its own reasons, for its own merits. It should not be seen as a kind of a substitute for SAARC. It cannot be a substitute for SAARC. So those who are looking at this as a kind of a rival or a competitor, we believe that that is not the right kind of policy. And my own experience when I was Foreign Secretary, I recall the summit that took place, summit which took place in Dhaka, where Nepal, because it was very upset with India for its support to the democracy movement in Nepal, and we had put sanctions against Nepal because the king had in a coup sort of taken over power in his own hands. In retaliating on that, In fact, Nepal produced a proposal for China to join as a full member of SAARC. And it was with considerable difficulty that we were able to diffuse that by ultimately having China, the United States, Japan, and Korea all enter as observers, observer states to SAARC. But that possibility remains. As I mentioned to you, the Trans-Himalayan circle of cooperation that China has floated. And there are also voices now saying, well, if India is not interested in SAARC, then let China come into SAARC, and India can stay away. How will you deal with that? So that danger is is certainly there. If you are worried about Chinese penetration in South Asia, then this is a very easy way of actually ensuring that. So as I said in answer to the question, that India, our view is, I'm not in government, but my view is certainly that we should see the way in which we can actually revive SAARC once again. And despite all the problems which may be there in terms of really promoting SAARC-wide cooperation, India, being the largest country, the largest economy, has the power, has the assets to be able to push the region-wide cooperation through SAARC. We should not give that up. That's a important element. Now, with regard to the various things that China is doing, of course, I touched upon it. Not only loans and projects that, particularly infrastructure projects that China has been doing, and as I mentioned to you, the great merit that many of our neighbors see in China, cooperation with China, is the speed of delivery that it is able to ensure, which India, despite all the effort it has been making, has not been able to really match that, because we have a parliament, we have audit systems, we have all kinds of institutional requirements that have to be fulfilled, which does not always operate in China. So China has an advantage in that respect. But even if that is the case, as I said, India has great advantage because, number one, it has great familiarity with the environment in which it will be operating. It has tremendous experience in dealing with the governments in the region, unmatched familiarity in a sense. There is, and conversely, our neighbors have great familiarity with how India operates, because many of them share the systems that we have. So in that respect, there is an advantage. The other aspect is that most of the funding that comes from China is not grant. China very rarely gives grants. It does give loans through Chinese state-owned banks. But the study that we have done in India, we see that several of them are actually almost commercial level, 5%, 6% rate of interest, which is pretty high in terms of developmental assistance. In most cases, when we give loans, they are actually very low interest rate loans. So there is, as we have seen in the case of Sri Lanka, there is the possibility of debt overhang as a result of this very large scale borrowing which has taken place. You see the big dispute that is there today between China and the Maldives on the airport project. What China is claiming as what should be repaid is being contested by the Maldives government. So there are those kind of issues. So while we recognize that yes, China does have more resources to deploy than India has, there are areas where we have also advantages, and we should try to leverage those advantages. What are the kind of infrastructure projects where the return will be, for both India as well as the neighbor, the return will be very high. That is the way we should be looking at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shyam Saran. I think, Christian, you can ask the question now.
Yes, thank you very much, Rahul. Shyam, first, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to listen to you. I hope I'm audible. It's a great pleasure to listen to your very fascinating presentation. I have a couple of points. Some of them are relatively controversial. I think we should discuss this over a cup of tea. But let me raise at least 3 points. What is interesting when you look at India's neighborhood policy, that it took India quite some time to take up the idea of regionalism. It's interesting that regionalism is long absent from India's foreign policy. Regionalism often is not, let's say, an addition of bilateral relations, but as you rightly mentioned, providing public goods. And I think this is a major challenge for India, because you see China now also entering into the business of region building in South Asia. It's not only what you mentioned with the Trans-Himalayan grouping. You can also raise issues that China has also its health Silk Road. So China may also use, let's say, the pandemic to strengthen its institutional grip or cooperation. But my general question is, why should the neighbors follow now India's proposal for economic regional integration? Why should they follow? The intra-regional trade is still low. SAARC is still, or South Asia is still regarded to be the least integrated region in the global comparison. So I'm not really seeing, let's say, the advantage for the neighbors, as China has given them so much concessions in the past. So where is the incentive, let's say, for the neighbors to cooperate with you and not with China? And this also brings me to another point, which is really quite an interesting topic. You said cultural affinity or the familiarity is an advantage for India. Let me be devil's advocate here. Is it an advantage or is it a disadvantage for India? I mean, when you look at the difficult relationship between India and the neighbors, a lot has to do with processes of nation building in the neighboring countries, from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. We all know these cases. So do the Chinese may not have an advantage because they do not have the cultural affinity? You just do business with the Chinese. Whereas when it comes to India, you always have other dimensions. You also have the cultural affinity, which to my reading is not necessarily an advantage. And when you look at the past, how many difficult debates you have had in neighboring countries on their relation to India, I wonder in how far this is really an argument for India to rely on, or should you not just then leave the neighbors with their own domestic debates and focus on economics, even if you still have a relatively difficult position? So thank you very much. These are just some of the points for your very fascinating presentation on this issue. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador Shyam Saran, you can take this question and then we'll move on to the next one. Yeah.
Okay. So as I mentioned in my presentation itself, with regard to regionalism, this is something which we actually came to pretty late. And I mentioned how this was something which actually became something more salient in the way India looked at, say, SAARC, or not just SAARC, but even looking at, say, Southeast Asia, the whole Act East policy. This sort of focus on regionalism is of more recent origin. And this is really the result of the economic reforms and liberalization policies adopted after 1990. So regionalism is not something that we originally started with. In fact, regionalism was, as I mentioned to you, it was that anything beyond our borders is very hostile, and you have to protect yourself against that hostile environment. Regionalism is something which is now as a policy, line. It is very well established. Nobody questions regionalism now. It's a question of, how do you roll this out? And as I mentioned to you, this is where the challenges lie. That while we have accepted, take for example, connectivity, as I mentioned, that there is a lot of investment which has been made in terms of physical connectivity, actually putting the railroads across the borders, the highways across the borders, investing in, say, optic fiber, connections with some of the neighboring countries. All that is actually a pretty strong effort on the part of the Indian government to bring about that physical connectivity. But the challenge is really not so much physical connectivity today, but the mindset with which you use that. That's why I say that you have the hardware of connectivity, but you do not necessarily have the software of connectivity, and that's something that you need to be able to address, which is being addressed, but not with the speed that you should. The big change was that we accepted connectivity as a very important objective, which was not there before. So it's an important change in that respect. The other aspect in terms of trade, as you mentioned, why should they be interested in economic integration with India? The fact is that if you look at the current economic and trade relationship, one is what is the formal relationship, but there is a huge informal relationship which we don't even take into account. If you started taking that into account, it is actually there is more integration on the ground than is perhaps visible in the formal sector. I say that with some practical knowledge, having served in Nepal and having served in Burma, in Myanmar as well. So my sense is that there is a huge potential which is not being actually allowed to really make an impact because of these other barriers that are there. And many of them are mindset barriers. So I have argued, for example, that we had the sort of overhang of the British colonial attitude towards border states as buffers. The border states had to be kept not particularly developed because they were seen as buffer states, again hostile borders. That is how you have, for example, the inner line permit, that even citizens of your own country can't go to certain places because these are very sensitive areas. The whole attitude towards border areas is only now changing. That actually your security is better served by having greater development in the border regions rather than keeping them underdeveloped. Now, in the context of India, this is a very important change that is taking place. Even when you are looking at, say, for example, the border with China, it is now being argued that we should be developing the areas in Ladakh or in Arunachal, have more people settled in these areas by bringing development to these areas, because that's actually adds to our security. So there is a lot of churn taking place. I mean, the problem is that things are not moving as rapidly as they should in this respect. The interest that our neighbors have in the economic integration project will be, if you, as I mentioned to you, are you prepared to open up your market truly to things which your neighbors want to sell to you? Now, Bangladesh wants to sell textiles to you because that is the area in which they have competitive advantage. Sri Lanka wants to sell, tea to you or spices to you, but there are local lobbies in India which will try to, prevent that from happening. This is a political question. How do you overcome some of those political? But it is not that the opportunities are not there. If you really opened up tomorrow and said, okay, Bangladesh, sell as much textiles or garments that you want to India, oh, that would be a huge market for Bangladesh. Similarly, with respect to say Sri Lanka or any other neighbor. So I do not think that there is a resistance to that. The resistance, if there is, it is from the Indian side. It is because you have not taken the right kind of policy decisions which would advance the integration process. As I mentioned to you, the transit issue. India is probably the most difficult in terms of providing transit. I gave you the example of how if you really opened up the Indian transport system to your neighbors, it would make a huge difference. Why should they take that very, very long route if India allowed the transit through its territory? So I do not see resistance from the neighbors in this respect. I see the resistance, far greater resistance from India's side itself. So that's the other aspect. Cultural affinity, as far as governments are concerned, states are concerned, yes, they want actually to play down the cultural affinity. And the more you try to suggest as India that, oh, we have cultural affinity, the more resistance there would be. But that does not wipe out the fact that actually those cultural affinities exist. So it's a question of a diplomatic challenge is how do I leverage that so that it gets reflected in the state-to-state relations, government-to-government relations, not in your face. The thing about cultural thing is that you have to avoid any suggestion, like it sometimes happens that all your culture came from India. Obviously there will be a resistance to that. But that does not wipe out the fact that there are actually very, very strong cultural affinities. If you just see the affinity, for example, between India and Nepal, irrespective of what the relationship between governments is, I mean, the kind of exchanges and the linkages which are there between the population in Nepal and India, it's very, very dense. So that density is there with virtually every neighbor, including with Pakistan. The question is there some way through somewhat subtle and more sophisticated policies, can you leverage that to begin to influence these state-to-state relations? My view is that yes, we can. And this I say again from my experience serving in some of the neighboring countries. I think it is possible if you go about it the right way. And therefore, I consider it an advantage vis-a-vis China.
Now, there are two more questions, but before I ask those two questions, I just want to kind of belabor this point a little bit, and therefore I will use the privilege of the chair to belabor this point. I mean, certainly, I think the points that you're making are, I personally am completely in agreement with it in terms of its rationality and its ideational value for promoting South Asia as a region. But, I'm aware of the fact that the Indo-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, for example, has a context. And that context is that there was the nuclear tests, there were sanctions against India, and India was globalizing. The Asian financial crisis had also happened. So this point that you're making gets highlighted. Globalization was a driving factor. So when we look at the Indo-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, India was actually able to make very asymmetrical concessions. And it was on the basis of those asymmetrical concessions that a very powerful lobby in Sri Lanka against the free trade agreement, of course, it was a preferential trading agreement, got convinced that it is not. And of course, diplomacy at that time, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon played a very good role, as I know a little bit from having visited Colombo. So the point that you're making is a very important one, that the imperative of globalization the imperative of global economic integration is a very, very important imperative and a rationale that should be driving India in the direction that you are suggesting. But my question to you is that has the state somewhat moved away from that paradigm of thinking? Because we know that rationalities are built also on ideas, and some ideas come to dominate the state. So India was moving quite a bit in the direction of using and embracing, let's say, some kind of a liberalism with a social face in order to promote its agenda. But with the current dispensation in power, some scholars have also noted that the manner in which Make in India is being promoted, the manner in which India's protectionism with respect to the rest of the world, rather than coming down, is really going up. So, for example, the same dynamics would be at work with regard to palm oil trade with Southeast Asia, right? So there would be a very strong lobby and it would be difficult to encounter, and therefore the India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement would have severe problems. But then when you have a state which, as you said, could promote this agenda, work with, domestic actors who would lose, and work for the larger interests of populations on both sides, which requires actually a proactive engagement, that would require the strong hand of the state. I mean, I have argued in my longer book that even 1991 was a heterodox reform. It was not purely an IMF prescribed reform. That's because there was a certain understanding within the state that in 1991, India was not going to do what it did in 1966. So the sort of the paradigm within the state itself is a very important driver of how you deal with these lobbies, how you move a certain kind of rationality forward. Would you therefore say that that driving force within the state, which may have been far more in favor of globalization, but with the coming of Make in India, has become much more supportive of powerful businesses within the country rather than promoting the globalization agenda? Because if that were the case, then no matter how good these ideas are, they would not be pursued with the same kind of alacrity as it would have in the past.
Okay, so the first point I would like to make is if you are looking at a straight line, evolution of these kind of trends, you will not get it, and this is not just true of India. I mean, it is true of many advanced democracies as well. You keep zigzagging. The important thing is, what is your direction, general direction? I would say, despite some of the elements that you have mentioned, the general direction is still towards greater globalization, greater, regional integration. Why do I say that? Even though what is happening in India, you should look at in the context of what is happening globally. Protectionism is far more advanced, I would say, in many of our trading partners. Compared to that, India is actually not being very protectionist. Even if you take our trade with China, despite the fact that, politically you want to somehow or the other, reduce that trade with China, you have not been successful because you are already very well integrated with the regional and the global economy. Even if you want to move away from it, your ability to now reverse direction is very difficult. But I would say that, number one, you should recognize that we will not go in a straight line, but the direction is in the right orientation is there. Secondly, we have to take it in the context of what is happening globally. It is not just India, seeming to adopt more protectionist policy. You see much more protectionism across the board, particularly amongst those countries which were great champions of free trade and great champions of, trade liberalization. And if you are talking about, made in India, well, even China, which is a great successful example, also has a made in China 2025. Industrial policy is not something which is only India that has been looking at. So I think we have to be a little nuanced in our appreciation of what is happening. And I would also point you to the fact that even though at a certain point it seemed that free trade agreements were being reviewed, India walked out of the RCEP saying that this will actually become like a free trade agreement with China. But look at the last 2 months. There has already been a change in position with regard to free trade agreements. You have the Commerce Secretary, you have ministers of the government saying, no, we actually want free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are good for the Indian economy. So there has been a shift. Why has there been a shift? Because there is a recognition that actually this is the way we have to go. We cannot afford to go back. So I think my own sense is, I may be wrong, but my own sense is that having tried that, a little more Atmanirbhar, a little more sort of nationalistic kind of a turn in terms of economic policy, the government has very quickly realized that actually India's interests are better served by continuing with this opening up of the Indian economy, looking at greater integration. The kind of challenges which we have, we need at this point of time, we need a lot of capital, we need a lot of technology. You cannot have that if you are going to have a relatively closed economy. That is essential. I mean, the Chinese example is in front of you, So I think that overall, I'm not pessimistic on that score. But I do grant that there will be ups and downs, which is the nature of democracy. I don't think we can get away from that.
Great. So I mean, the important message is that there can be zigzags, but the technocratic elite has the capacity to understand that certain things, policy corrections can be
even the political elite. Even the political, after all, eventually the technocratic elite has to convince the political elite. Absolutely. Otherwise, you would not get very far.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think they have been able to convince the political elite that, this will probably get you to a dead end.
Yeah, and it seems that we are moving in that direction, because whether it is democracy or development, I think the indicators are all fast declining. So
well,
so
I think I'm more worried on the political side. I'm less worried on the economic side.
Great. So I think that's a very, very important insight. I think there are two questions. One question I will just read out from, both the questions are now on the chat. One is by my student Tanvi Deshpande. She says, thank you very much. My first question relates to India's domestic climate adjustments. Has India made any significant domestic policy adjustments since 2008 National Action Plan on Climate Change? My second question is on how India is cooperating with states from the South Asian region. How is India cooperating with other states? Would you like to take this question first?
And yeah, okay. So as far as the domestic climate change agenda is concerned, it's a mixed picture. I mean, and I think one would expect it to be a mixed picture. But overall, as I would say, and I was very much involved in the formulation of the National Action Plan on Climate Change when I was Prime Minister's Special Envoy on climate change. So a lot of investment went into drawing up that plan. Let me say that I'm very encouraged by the progress that we have made, for example, as far as the National Solar Mission is concerned. That's one of the success stories. Frankly, if I had been asked, in 2010, will we be able to make this much progress as far as solar power is concerned, I would have said probably not. I mean, more modest gains, but not what we have actually been able to achieve. So that's a good story to tell. Even with regard to coal, which has been such a point of focus at the Glasgow climate summit, most people do not realize that actually if you really look at the trends there, One, even though India does not have a carbon tax, which is one of the big proposals with regard to, the climate change action. India successively has put fairly large cess on coal production. Started with about 50 rupees per ton. Now it is something like 400 rupees per ton. Now, given income levels in India, 400 rupees per ton on a major source of energy is pretty impressive. It actually mobilizes a fairly large amount of funds from that. So it is in effect a carbon tax. So India has actually done more in terms of moving away from coal than many other countries. Even though India had, at the time that I was dealing with climate change, at that time, I remember we had in the pipeline 100,000 megawatt of coal-based power that was supposed to be in the pipeline. Today, I think we are not even pursuing 40% of that because coal-based power is becoming uneconomic. Because, renewable energy tariffs are coming down, consistently coming down. So going forward, it will not be worth the while of either the state or the private sector to actually invest money into coal-based power. India is today a power exporter. One of the big success stories for India is that we are exporting power to Bangladesh. We even export power to Nepal. Frankly speaking, we had thought that India will always be power hungry, will always have a power shortage, given the very ambitious growth rates that we were looking at, 8%, 9% per annum. But because those growth rates were actually not realizable, we have ended up with a fairly large surplus of power. So going forward, I do not see coal being, the kind of, expanding source of energy in India as may have been anticipated, say, 5 years or 10 years ago. If you look at what we have been able to achieve on the renewable energy side, in particular solar, again, the story is very good. The solar power expansion has been very impressive. Wind less so, but pretty. And some of these success stories are not very well known. For example, the popularization of LED lighting. That has led to a very big change in terms of energy conservation. If you are looking at things like, say, the star rating system for electrical appliances, again, has made a huge difference in terms of really promoting, much more efficient, electrical appliances in India, both for the consumer as well as for the manufacturer. Because the manufacturer finds that if he has a 5-star rating in terms of, energy saving, he has a bigger market. And the consumer, of course, prefers a 5-star because his electricity bill is therefore much lower. So there are many things like this which are happening, which actually tell a very good story. Unfortunately, the government is not very good at telling its story. But actually, the story is, as someone who has been associated with climate change work in India, I think it is a good story. The second part of the story is not so good, which is what are the countries of South Asia doing in order to collaborate with each other in order to deal with the issue of climate change. And here, again, India will have to take the lead. So you take a simple example like our river systems. River systems start in the mountains with the glaciers, run through your plains, get into the ocean. I mean, it's a living system right through. You cannot actually use these living systems, chop them up and say, this is my property, that is your property. You cannot deal with, say, the challenges which we face in terms of our river systems by chopping them up. Not possible. Similarly, with regard to the Himalayas, the Himalayan zone, the whole Himalayan zone that you have is one integrated zone. So if you think that you can deal with the melting of glaciers with regard to only the Indian portion and not have anything to do with what is there in Bhutan or in Nepal, not possible. Or if we are looking at biodiversity, the animals, the whole wildlife that we have in the subcontinent, we are one of the richest biodiverse regions in the world. But only now we are thinking in terms of, for example, these corridors, ecological corridors. We already have them, say, with Bhutan, some with Nepal, where wildlife can cross, and recross, without having to observe, national boundaries, because, animals don't observe national boundaries. So these kind of issues, we have not really been able to tackle very well. So if you look at, say, the river systems, the mangroves, for example, in the Sundarbans, in the Ganges Delta, they are very, very important in terms of, the ecological conservation. Now, because a whole lot of chemical effluents from upper stream are actually coming down in the ocean, large parts of the Bay of Bengal is what is called as dead zone. That is, there is no marine life at all possible in that particular zone. A lot of plastic is actually also coming into the ocean. Overfishing taking place all around the Indian peninsula. Affects not only India, but Sri Lanka, Maldives. It is a very important source of protein for populations in our region. And yet we are overfishing and destroying, that resource. So these kind of issues, these kind of challenges can only be dealt with through a collaborative response, not a competitive response. Now, intellectually, I know that. The question is, while we know that intellectually, how do we translate that into actually, sitting down at the table and working out how do we collaborate on this? That particular step we have not been there. And here, as I once again repeat, the only country in the region which can actually take the lead and make this happen is India. No other country can do that.
Tanvi, I think, has a quick counter question, and then I will ask the last question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for your insightful comments. My question is about how you mentioned about India's climate mitigation sort of action, but in terms of adaptation, all developing countries need to kind of take serious adaptation measures because a vast number of population is kind of vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And apart from reducing or combating our sort of climate impacts just by reducing our emissions is not just the only way. We also need to adapt. So how has India sort of done or progressed in terms of adaptation measures?
Well, very little. I mean, the adaptation that is actually taking place is only when it is crisis induced. So, flooding takes place, for example, in the major cities in India, because your urban infrastructure is not geared to dealing with, much more frequent rainfall, more intense rainfall during a shorter period of time. So flooding becomes a regular phenomena in our urban areas. Or what is happening with respect to, if you take, for example, fruit growing, whereas apples would grow at 7,000 feet, now you have to grow apples at 9,000 feet in some of the Himalayan states. So partly adaptation is taking place naturally in a sense, but a lot of the other adaptation is being forced upon us because of crises taking place. There is no adaptation plan as such. With regard to dealing with this, and even with adaptation, you can only do adaptation in collaboration in this region. You cannot chop it up and say, I will adapt here, but I will forget about what's happening elsewhere. You cannot do that. That's the reality. So this is where the international negotiations and what our domestic issue is, they get interlinked. Because even if by any miracle tomorrow emissions became zero, climate change will continue to take place. Because climate change is taking place due to the accumulated greenhouse gas emissions in the Earth's atmosphere. And the carbon emissions will stay in the Earth's atmosphere for something like 100 years or 200 years. It diminishes only very slowly. So whatever has been put there will continue to cause climate change. Even if, as I said, your mitigation strategies are 100% successful and you come to zero emissions. Now, this is where in the multilateral negotiations, countries like India have been making that point. That the whole focus appears to be on mitigation, but you are not really looking at adaptation. The one small breakthrough which we made at Glasgow was that the amount which is committed for adaptation, which was about $15 billion, it was agreed that it would be doubled to $30 billion. But the adaptation costs are in trillions of dollars. So the supportive international regime that you need to help developing countries adapt to climate change, which is already taking place and will continue to take place well into the future, I'm afraid the international support for that is simply not there. So this is where the question of equity comes. That unless you have an international regime which observes the principle of equity and equitable burden sharing, how can you deal with these issues? So adaptation, yes, you are right. We don't have a national, if you're looking for a national adaptation plan, I'm afraid does not exist. We have not got to that point. So essentially it is ad hoc. When something happens, then we are reacting to it. But otherwise, it's not that there is a long-term plan. Okay, this is what the science is telling us, and this is how we must, prepare ourselves for adaptation. I'm afraid that's not the case. Even on things like defense, you are going to be all your troops which are deployed on the border. They are going to be very much impacted by, say, melting of the glaciers. You have had avalanches where, whole bases have been completely destroyed. Or you have naval bases. If there is a rise in the sea levels, that will be also impacted. Are we thinking in those terms, even in those very narrow national security terms? I'm afraid not really very much. I mean, I feel sad that I have to admit this, but that's the case.
Yeah, so I think we have the capacity to think, but we often do not act and think in terms of.
Also, the matter of resources.
Yeah,
these cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And there are competing, demands on the scarce resources that we have.
Yeah. So I think the last question is from Mr. Prem Singh Gill. He had raised his hand, so I will request him to ask the question verbally rather than read it out.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Okay. Like in regards to in last year on the Lippo Lake Pass, May 2020, I mean, when interpreting the India-Nepal border dispute, so that I have this one question majorly, does this crisis reflect a failure of Indian neighborhood first policy? And does this dispute solution sought international law mediation rather than to just politically, settlements? But I feel that since India never had any issue before with Nepal, they would be very good friends. And also you've mentioned that most of the cases with India and Pakistan, also SAARC, I feel that the India-Pakistan, the SAARC relation, it all depends on the India and Pakistan rather than, so China card, it depends as well. So what do you reckon on this Lippo Lake Pass on the, on the Nepal case?
Well, if we go very dispassionately based on, historical evidence and documentation, and on Nepal's own position, Nepali maps never showed this strip of territory as being Nepali territory. It is only something that they've done last year when this issue came up. This was raised by Nepal more in the context of domestic politics rather than as a issue, pending border issue between India and Nepal. And if you look at the China-Nepal border treaty, which was concluded in 1960, the starting point of that particular border treaty is in fact a little to the east of the Lipulekh Pass. So it is not west of the pass. The pass has always been and has always been shown even in Nepali maps as being part of India, and that was, as I mentioned, was even recognized in the China-Nepal border treaty. The starting point was not shown where they are showing it right now. Even today, the Chinese have not accepted that Nepali position. This, as I said, is much more in relation to domestic politics. Now, was there a failure on the part of India? Well, I mean, relations with between two countries, you have both countries have a responsibility. It can't be the responsibility of only one side. I think India's response was a fairly mature response, that they did not sort of let it impact on every other aspect of India-Nepal relations. And as you see today, despite the fact that that issue is there, the present Nepali government has not raised this as something that has to be sorted out before other aspects of relations are pursued. Okay, I mean, they have complicated the relationship between the two countries, but that is something that we will have to live with. There is no question of India compromising on this particular issue. In terms of the overall management of relations with Nepal, I think there will be several areas where you could say that India's policy has not been entirely successful. No doubt about that. That we have perhaps not fully not handled not just relations with Nepal, but with neighbors themselves. We have the right policy. That is, we have said neighborhood first, which reflects precisely what I have been arguing, that you cannot see India playing a larger regional role or a larger global role if it cannot get its neighborhood right. It is only if you are able to successfully manage your periphery, only then can you think in terms of a larger regional role or a global role. So that's a given, and that is reflected in the government's declared policy of neighborhood first. So at least that recognition is there. That's an important point, that yes, the priority has to be given to our relations with our immediate neighbors. But then when you have said that, what are you doing in terms of actually translating that policy on the ground? So that to me would mean that I should invest much more both in human resources as well as in material resources in the management of those relations. Human resources means what? If you have one joint secretary in the ministry, sitting in the Ministry of External Affairs, who has to handle relations with 2 or 3 neighbors, where so much is happening with that neighbor, obviously, there will not be much attention given to the managing the relationship. You need many more people, and many more people who are knowledgeable about relations with that country, right? Also, the relationship cannot be just at the bureaucratic level. It cannot be just a couple of officers from the Ministry of External Affairs who are handling this relationship, or somebody from the Ministry of Commerce handling the trade relationship. The relationship has to be at different levels. That is, at the lowest level, but also at the highest political level. At every layer, you must have that engagement, constant engagement. What is happening today is that the whole system gets activated if there is a crisis in the relationship. But if there is no crisis in the relationship, then you sort of start neglecting the relationship. That is not how neighborhood policy can work. So in terms of the policy line itself, yes, it is correct. Neighborhood first policy is the right policy for India to follow. But that has to be translated in terms of where the priority actually is, in terms of how you deploy your human resources and how you deploy your material resources. You have to give much more attention and you have to put more resources in that engagement with the neighborhood than is the case today.
Thank you very much, sir. But one last thing I want to point out, like
I think Mr. Gill, we have to end here because we are already past our time, and this is, I'm sure, a conversation, a very important conversation, and not so easy to end. And we don't want to end with agreements. We can beg to differ.
Thank you very much for your insightful.
So I think we have a couple of very, very enlightening take-homes today. The first take-home is something that was not in the lecture, but which is something that Ambassador Shyam Saran has co-authored, which is the document that goes beyond non-alignment 2.0, and which he mentioned briefly in the passing, that India needs to strengthen its domestic political infrastructure, as well as what was mentioned in this talk, to a very great extent, its ability to engage with the neighbors. So unless these two strengths don't come together, it's not going to be easy for India to deal with the neighborhood. The second very important point that was sort of belabored upon is the idea that India has to work with the processes of global economic integration, especially within the region, in order to strengthen the region and itself, rather than viewing the region as a zero-sum game, which has been the history of India's approach to SAARC for a very long time, that was only transcended in the 1990s after the period of globalization. So one has to go back to that, one has to think in terms of national treatment, one has to think in terms of looking at the neighborhood as one's own. And this, I think, is a very, very important message, because somehow India's neighbors don't feel like that. And very often, as an Indian, when you go and stay for some time in the neighboring countries, you often come back to India with the feeling that people in India do not really understand how the neighbors perceive India. So the point that Ambassador Saran made today is a very, very important point, that India has to be very, very sensitive to the neighborhood perspective, from the neighbor's perspective. And I think there is some hope also. He mentioned that there is probably some policy correction that's happening, even if there was a zigzag. And let us hope that that hope and that zigzag will move in the right direction, so that much of the optimism that we want to go back home with gets realized, both on the domestic political front as well as on the global economic integration front and the South Asian regional economic integration front. So with that, really, really many, many thanks for, I think, a very important, clear-headed, astutely argued, both as a practitioner and obviously as somebody who has read and understood the region better than most others, to give us this perspective. And I must just add that the audience as well, Christian has been very generous. He enriches our colloquium. He has also presented in our colloquium, and my colleagues, especially Mr. Jaishankar Prasad, who actually helps coordinate the colloquium with my other colleague, Mr. Mostafizur Rahman, who is sitting here, but has, you can only see his picture as Mia Mostafiz, and the rest of my colleagues in the department who helped make this a very lively discussion. And thank you for all for participating. So I will end this conversation here, and I will keep bugging Ambassador Shyam Saran to learn more privately and publicly. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Thank you.